Take number three. Big boards always felt as if they were so far away. Every year, the seniors would stress and scramble the presentations together as us underclassmen, so worry free at the time, stood on the sidelines laughing at the panic. Then one day, around this time last year, I realized it was my turn. Well, hell, where do I start? I thought the obvious thing to do was to find a topic, but what? I asked myself what I found interesting or what really mattered to me. Something came to mind almost instantaneously: fashion. But what about it? Sure, I spend most of my money on clothing. I follow designers and what they put out each season. But what is that relevance to all of us? The bigger picture, I guess. I've been set on studying fashion in school for the past few years, and now is my time to start. After researching more than just the Vogues and other editorials lying under my bed, I started to my view of fashion and its importance completely changed. The years I spent gawking at runway reviews and style blogs started to connect the dots between what I had learned then and the historical background I was now researching. I noticed reappearing trends, diminishing fads, and most of all, a message. Human beings have a hard time analyzing the now because we only notice the differences, but looking to the past, we notice the similarities. This is why I always found it hard when I looked at my editorials and at the Vogues that I've talked about to see a message behind everything and to see what authors were really trying to say. Um, so studying what I thought I knew so well at one point has me here today to tell you how and why fashion is the most universal form of both cultural and individual expression. I'm going to pull someone up wearing jeans. So Cameron, what were you thinking when you got dressed this morning, if anything at all? Nothing, Benny. Well, that seems to be the case a lot, which makes people question whether there really is a deeper meaning behind what we wear or not. Understandable. If it's not yourself getting a message across through your outfit, then it's the clothing itself. Blue jeans were first popularized in America during the 1930s, the era of patriotism and westerns. John Wayne and other stallion riders were constantly seen in blue denim. The boys who admired the men and their mystique begged their parents for as many pairs as they could afford. This is when Levi's first started to get big. The next jean phase happened right after World War II, in which soldiers wore jeans, making it okay for more than just little gun-ho Jimmy to wear them. In the 50s, James Dean and his bad boy persona altered the vibe. Jeans were the trouser choice for greasers and rebels alike. There's backstory to what all of you are wearing, whether you're aware of it or not. But before we delve any deeper into clothing as expression, let's discuss the origins of dress, function. Looking at early America, settlers dressed very basic. Men wore cotton trousers, often coveralls, which with cotton shirts underneath, thick-soled work boots, and wide-brimmed hats. Women often wore spacious dresses, which allowed more comfort and room to move. With their lace and cotton dresses, they wore their hair back with bonnets in and linen gloves on. These people were labor workers. Men's coveralls kept their pants up, no worry when building. Their loose cotton shirts helped reduce perspiration, but absorbing what little there was. Their thick boots gave them better ground in a couple inches. Wide-brimmed hats kept the sun out their eyes. Women's dress allowed them to be both mothers and workers. Bonnets kept dirt from getting in their hair while working. Gloves protected their hands from tools and sun. While there may not be some deep meaning in the clothing itself, the lack of it says something about the culture. These people were working people and were building the foundation of America. Early settlers hadn't specialized yet. The lack of complexity shows that early Americans were focused on building. As cultures progress and start to specialize, the clothing they wear becomes more and more expressive. The ancient Romans had one type of clothing, togas. Both men and women wore these either linen or wool garments that draped over the torso and legs, exposing one's shoulder. It wasn't until years after Rome established itself that a change is noticed in the way of dress. For those who were reputable in society and could afford it, gold tassels and embroidered lines were added to the once basic garment to either symbolize political role, marital status, or affluence. As time moved on, these distinguished togas became more prevalent among the rich, and eventually created defining borders between socio-economic classes. Now, here's a picture of the togas. We have colored shoes and broad stripes identifying this man as a senator. The woman next to him is obviously married, or at least according to the stole on their head. And the man to the right of the senator is wearing a special robe and wreath, signifying him as an emperor. This is one of the earliest examples of clothing separating influential from insubstantial. The idea of rank being symbolic by what people were wearing is prevalent through history. During the 15th century, after the Hundred Years' War ended, large-scale changes made their way to common attire. Your average Englishwoman wore a bland cotton shawl, and her husband sported mesh doublets. But the war had ended, which opened up trade routes, fluctuating fabrics and furs that had never been seen in the areas of Western Europe. These new luxurious materials were first limited and expensive. To afford such fine fabric, you had to have money and good reputation. The folks at the higher end of the monarch were first served. Women wore fine lynx jackets and squirrel fur hats. Men wore beaver fur hooplets, a type of extravagant robe. As time passed and commerce continued, these materials became more and more prevalent, eventually trickling down to lower classes. I call it fashionomics. After those furs died out, the next major material to make its way to Western Europe was silk from the Mediterranean. Dresses and robes were stitched with the silk until it became too trendy and made its way to the peasants, once again killing a fad and restarting a cycle. I could go on for days, but let's get to some deeper meaning. When looking into the past, it's noticed that oppression is a key motivator to self-expression. When man has few freedoms, one of them tends to be the ability to dress freely. During the 30 Years' War and under the ruling of King Louis XVI, common wardrobe stuck to a more militaristic basic. Close-cut shoulders and undefined layers were most common. However, once the war was over and Louis XVI's regime was through, oppression of the people's freedoms, especially religious freedoms, influenced all types of art and clothing. The Protestant Reformation had begun, beginning the late Baroque period. Baroque, meaning rough or imperfect pearl in French, perfectly symbolizes the movement that had begun. It was all about emotion, reflection, and irregularity. Common apparel went from drab to fad, as the boring militaristic influences went out the window. Loud gold lining hinted dresses and tops, symbolizing holiness and good fortune. High-waist pants and restrictive silhouettes were replaced with clothing that fit similar to how people felt, comfortable and free. Tops were loosened, waists were lowered, and both men and women wore breathable coats. Colors were brightened, and a sense of decorative exuberance found its way in everyday clothing. People were expressive, and their clothing reflected that. Fast forwarding about 250 years, America was nearing the end of World War I, a war that sucked a lot out of Americans financially and emotionally. It was a war started by the older generation, disgusting the younger one. After the war ended and the country collectively sighed, an immense change in culture and clothing started to rev. As the black community popularized jazz and gained a bit of standing in America, the zoot suit made its first appearance. A flamboyant suit made of every bright color and pattern imaginable stood for the frivolity and fun black culture finally got to experience. The largest shift was seen in the youth. With all their hostility for the older generations, people ranging from the low 20s to 40s did the best they could to look as young as possible. This hatred was so common that the sales of men's grooming products that promoted facial hair growth and were beyond popular before the war plummeted. The sales of safety razors that gave babyface smoothness skyrocketed. Fashion and its direction belonged to the youth. The flapper, a style newly introduced by the jazz scene, became common among youngsters. Women wore short skirts and bobbed hair. Brassieres became more common and minimized breast size. Men wore pinstripe suits and vests. The need to look as young as possible became so serious that women began to strictly diet to reduce and mold their bodies to teenage sizes. When the war was over, the soldiers came back to a new thriving culture, a more liberal one. Sex was more openly talked about, and stigma surrounding it was lessened. Women's hemlines rose from ankle to midcalf. Due to a shortage of fabrics and dye, clothing was made less colorful and given a nude look. This bare feel was made trendy amongst women's clothing. This is the first example of women's empowerment being vocalized in clothing they wore. Men's suits grew coattails, and their watches became wristwatches. The fun, free spirit of the Roaring Twenties adapted was an obvious attempt to heal the wounds World War II left behind. But high spirits crashed along with the stock market in 1929. The 30s were a moderately stagnant time for fashion in America. The hardest economic times they had seen yet. People were too focused on trying to survive to revolutionize clothing. It wasn't until World War II began to escalate that clothing did as well. The men were gone serving in the military, so women had to pick up the labor they left behind. The clothing they the clothing they wore did as well, or the clothing they wore quickly evolved with their new positions. Luxury designers like Chanel and Prada started to design baggier, loose-fitting pants, ones that were comfortable to work in. Expenditure for these women were scarce, resulting in a major increase of upcycling old clothing, most commonly seen with men's suits. This is where shoulder pads in women's clothing was first implemented, a trend that has been seen numerous times since. This more masculine feel finally introduced androgyny to clothing. After the war ended and the men were sent home, another shift in clothing occurred. All military-related design was pushed out. Men just wanted to relax and appreciate the fact that they were finally home. Tropical and Hawaiian prints became wildly popular, not just presenting the comforting idea of being in the tropics, but as homage to those who were stationed at Pearl Harbor. The next prominent war to make difference in the way people dressed was the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War inspired a movement that will forever be branded in American nostalgia and that has made an impact on art, philosophy, and clothing and is still seen today, the hippie movement. Born out of opposition to American involvement, this cultural revolution was led by predominantly young pacifists who believe in peace, love, and nature. All these benefits were made visible in what these hippies wore. Many of these young Americans were not affluent and had to minimize costs. Cheap white shirts were purchased and then dyed with every color to symbolize synergy and togetherness. And here I'll have Michael Tabby get up and do a little twirl and show what he's wearing. This array of every color imaginable was also relevant to the hallucinations a lot of these LSD-consuming freebirds experienced, and the idea of blended difference. Hippies also decorated their jackets with flowers and peace signs, obvious allusions to respecting nature and ending an unnecessary war. Mockery was also used in the way they dressed, often wearing open army jackets with no shirt underneath, jabbing at the military, but also respecting the camouflage for its earthy tones. Cheesy, I know. But these examples of fashion, so aptly reflecting a society's reactionary thoughts on war, prove how well clothing can express a culture. But war is not the only form of oppression to influence change. It was the 1940s, and when women finally began to break into the world of working beyond the front desk or classroom. More women began to become independent and self-sufficient, creating one of the biggest shifts in women's wear. It was Yves Saint Laurent, one of the most respected and unforgettable names in fashion, who designed the first tuxedo for women. Dubbed the smoking tuxedo, this bold move was a courageous action on both the wearer and designer's part. The smoking tux was all about setting women on the same tier as men, and begging the question, why can't women do what a man can? Whether he knew it or not at the time, Laurent was the first designer to inspire feminism with his clothing. Although women were set back a bit with the return of soldiers in '45, we see resurgence of this power clothing in the '80s. Stacked heels, suits, pinstripe pants, and war paint makeup symbolize women's plight in the concrete jungle. Thomas Mayer, creative director at the very high-end clothing designer Bottega Veneta, said, "At the end of every cycle, there is a desire to go on." Mayer perfectly captures the driving force fashion is, and how it keeps culture progressing. In the headbanging and Nirvana listening days of the '90s, a style to revolt against the affluent men of Wall Street and conservative thinking was born. The grunge movement had begun. Bred by the music scene in Seattle, grunge clothing consisted of tattered jeans, flannels around the waist, and beaten Converse that read "FU" on the toe. This is where I'll have Avery walking around. The rough look and screw-off attitude that came with it spoke out against the money-grubbing yuppies of the time and allowed a person to feel comfortable doing so. After the market crash in 2008, the grunge look made a serious comeback, and it's still with us today. Hopefully one hasn't been led to believe that dressing is only a medium for societal representation. The basis of fashion is individualism. It is a human's chance to present themselves in any way they please, to promote, to protest, and to express. It's a collection of these individuals that represents a society's ideas. And fashion has so appropriately allowed both the individual and the culture to express an idea, not only those who wear the clothing, but those who make it. The intent and evaluation behind fashion keeps society moving forward. Robert Coulier once said, "Every contrivance of man, every tool, every instrument, every utensil, every article designed for use, of each and every kind, evolved from a very simple beginning."